Munchausen syndrome by proxy, or MSBP, is a disorder that developed from Munchausen syndrome, in which one will exaggerate or lie about medical symptoms or trauma in order to gain sympathy and attention. This condition typically occurs in the presence of abuse or neglect. MSBP has since developed into a condition in which one uses someone else as a pawn to gain sympathy, and the symptoms and illnesses described are usually legitimate and induced by the caretaker. One extreme example is the case of Marybeth Tinning, who enjoyed a murdering career that spanned over 7 years. Marybeth Tinning was born in New York in 1942 as Marybeth Rowe. While her father was off fighting in World War II, her mother worked to support the family. Tinning was left to be cared for by indifferent family members, some even going so far as to say she was an unplanned baby. Tinning suffered abuse at the hands of her father, who often beat her for crying, which led her to have frequent tantrums. During her childhood, she attempted to exert some control over her life by trying to boss her peers around at school, even handling legitimate authority as a school bus monitor very poorly. She was also prone to telling exaggerated stories and outright lies about herself in order to gain attention. In high school, she was not very well remembered, even after her crimes were discovered. After high school, Marybeth held numerous jobs until she married Joe Tinning in 1965. The couple had their first child 2 years later, in 1967, and a second child in 1970. While pregnant with her third child in 1971, her father passed away unexpectedly. She reportedly did not take the death well. Even though the abuse long since stopped and Tinning recalled the abuse vividly, she was still deeply saddened by his passing. When she gave birth to her daughter a couple of weeks after, the infant died just 1 week later. The nurses recalled Marybeth's behavior as passive and that she did not cry. Even though they noted her disturbing behavior, no therapy was suggested. In light of the recent deaths in her life, Marybeth received an outpour of sympathy from her family and friends, and she came to enjoy the attention and love. A little over 2 weeks later, Tinning brought her son to the emergency room, telling staff that he had stopped breathing and was having seizures. The hospital staff kept a close watch on him for 10 days until returning him to the care of his mother. The same day he returned home, he was rushed back to the hospital, with Tinning claiming he was found in his bedroom. The cause of death was not determined, but it was suspected at the time to be cardiorespiratory arrest. In 1973, Marybeth brought her 4-year-old daughter to the hospital, claiming that she was suffering from convulsions. The hospital staff insisted on keeping her overnight, but Marybeth insisted on taking her home. Several hours later, Marybeth returned to the hospital with her unconscious daughter, and she died several hours later. The death was attributed to sudden infant death syndrome, though doctors cast their own doubts. Tinning later gave birth to a 4th child in 1973. The child was taken to the hospital 3 weeks later, claiming she found him lifeless in his crib. Doctors, not being able to find anything wrong with the child, also attributed his death to sudden infant death syndrome. In 1975, Tinning had a 5th child. At 3 weeks old, he too was brought to the hospital with severe bleeding from his mouth and nose. Pneumonia was the official diagnosis. However, 1 month later, he was brought back to the hospital again, and this time he was pronounced dead. It was at this time that the hospital staff became divided with the frequent deaths and their causes. Marybeth attributed the deaths to bad genetics, but her co-workers began to mention that every time she was pregnant, she was going to kill another baby. When Tinning and her husband applied to an adoption agency and came home with a new child, he too died suddenly, discrediting the bad gene theory. At the time of the adopted child's death, Marybeth was already pregnant. Her 6th child was born in October 1978 and died in February 1979. Marybeth again became pregnant and had a child in November 1979. He was brought to the hospital on March 1980, citing breathing problems. When the child was deemed to be healthy, he was sent back home, only to return a few days later, this time dead. Marybeth treated each death as a small social gathering. Announcements of each birth and death garnered her much attention, and she reportedly did not cry during any of these gatherings. The rapid deaths brought the suspicion of her friends. Marybeth's last victim was her 9th child, who was born in August 1985 and died that following December. Her latest murder caused her sister-in-law to note that she did not seem the least bit upset over the death. Indeed, the 9 deaths brought the attention of authorities, who ordered an autopsy, revealing that the child had been suffocated. When the arrest came, Marybeth confessed to the murders of 3 of her children, but not the others. In 1987, she was found guilty for the murder of her last child and was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. Since then, Tinning confessed that she was going through tough times when she committed her murders. Since 2007, Marybeth Tinning was denied parole 5 times, as recently as 2015. Marybeth Tinning has been deemed to still show no remorse for her crimes and continues to serve her sentence at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women in New York.